Some actors played tough. These men lived through things that would break most people in half. One of them crashed into shark-infested waters years before anyone knew his name and had to swim to shore in the dark. Another was arrested more than 40 times in his life and still got cast specifically because directors wanted someone who was genuinely, authentically dangerous. And the man waiting at number 1 on this list survived a crash landing at sea that almost erased his entire career before it even began, years before anyone would ever recognize his face. These are 10 more toughest actors in Hollywood history, Part 2. Number 10. Woody Strode. Woody Strode was one of the finest natural athletes California ever produced. At UCLA in 1939, he shared a single backfield with 2 other men who would each go on to break historic color barriers of their own, Jackie Robinson and Kenny Washington. Strode himself was a world-class decathlete, capable of a shot-put throw that came within a few feet of the world record and a high jump that wasn't far behind it either. When World War II broke out, Strode joined the Army Air Corps and spent much of the war doing the punishing, unglamorous work of loading bombs onto aircraft in Guam and the Marianas, all while still finding time to play football for his unit's team. In 1946, Strode and Kenny Washington signed with the Los Angeles Rams, becoming 2 of the first black players to enter the modern NFL after a shameful 13-year unofficial ban on black athletes in the league. Strode later transitioned into professional wrestling before Hollywood came calling, and once there, his sheer physical power became legendary on set. During the filming of The Professionals in 1966, Burt Lancaster, a man widely known throughout the industry for his own considerable physical strength, reportedly challenged Strode to informal contests of strength between takes and was said to be genuinely frustrated that he kept losing. Strode would go on to earn a Golden Globe nomination for his lead performance in John Ford's Sergeant Rutledge, becoming one of the first black actors to headline a major Hollywood Western. Strode faced open hostility during his brief NFL career, including opposing players who deliberately tried to injure him because of the color of his skin, and he later said that professional wrestling, for all its theatrics, had actually treated him with more genuine respect than professional football initially did. He went on to appear in more than 100 films across 5 decades, becoming a trusted member of director John Ford's informal repertory company and delivering a performance in Spartacus, as Kirk Douglas's fellow gladiator and eventual ally, that remains one of the most physically commanding supporting turns in the history of the genre. He was laid to rest with full military honors at Riverside National Cemetery. Number 9. Jim Brown. Before Jim Brown ever appeared in a single film, he had already built one of the greatest athletic resumes in American sports history. At Syracuse University, Brown was a 2-sport All-American in football and lacrosse, a combination almost nobody has matched before or since. He then spent 9 seasons with the Cleveland Browns, and by the time he walked away from professional football in 1966, at the absolute peak of his career, he held the NFL's all-time rushing record and was widely regarded, even by opposing players who had to tackle him, as the single most physically dominant runner the league had ever produced. Brown retired from football at only 29 years old, specifically to pursue an acting career, a decision that stunned the sports world at the time but one he never publicly regretted. In films like The Dirty Dozen, released the same year he retired from the NFL, Brown brought a level of raw, coiled physical presence to the screen that came from a decade of absorbing and delivering some of the hardest hits professional football has ever recorded. Co-stars and directors alike described him as a man who never needed to perform intimidation because it was simply the natural byproduct of who he already was. Over his 9 NFL seasons, Brown averaged an almost unheard of 5.2 yards every single time he carried the football, a number that remains one of the most statistically dominant in league history more than half a century later, and he accomplished it while never once missing a game due to injury despite absorbing hit after hit from defenses that had no answer for him. In Hollywood, Brown went on to headline more than 30 films, frequently cast in roles that leaned directly into his imposing physical presence, and he remained a towering, controversial, and deeply influential figure in both sports and entertainment for the rest of his long life. To this day, NFL historians still argue about whether anyone has ever truly surpassed what Jim Brown accomplished on a football field. Number 8. Robert Ryan. Robert Ryan graduated from Dartmouth College in 1932, holding a distinction almost no other Hollywood leading man could claim. He was the school's undefeated heavyweight boxing champion for all 4 years he attended, on top of also lettering in football and track. After graduation, Ryan spent years doing genuinely hard physical labor, working as a stoker shoveling coal on a ship bound for Africa and as a ranch hand in Montana, long before he ever set foot near a film set. When World War II arrived, Ryan, already a working actor under contract to RKO, enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in January of 1944 and served as a drill instructor at Camp Pendleton, training thousands of young Marines who would go on to fight in the Pacific. While there, he also won additional boxing championships within the Marine Corps itself, adding to a fighting record that had already been formidable a decade earlier. Ryan's imposing 6'4" frame and genuinely hardened physical presence translated directly into some of film noir's most convincing and menacing performances, earning him an Academy Award nomination for his role as a violent bigot in 1947's Crossfire. What made Ryan particularly remarkable was the contrast between his on-screen menace and his real convictions, since he was, in real life, a committed and outspoken civil rights advocate for decades, using the same physical and moral toughness that had made him a boxing champion to fight for causes he actually believed in. He continued working steadily for nearly 3 decades after his discharge, delivering acclaimed performances in westerns and war films opposite the likes of John Wayne and Spencer Tracy, and he even shared a Broadway stage with Katharine Hepburn in a 1960 production of Antony and Cleopatra, proving that the same discipline that had once earned him a heavyweight title could carry a Shakespearean tragedy just as convincingly. Number 7. Jack Palance. Jack Palance grew up the son of a Ukrainian immigrant coal miner in Pennsylvania and worked in the mines himself before athletics gave him a way out. He won a football scholarship, dropped out to become a professional boxer under the name Jack Brazzo, and won his first 15 fights, 12 by knockout, before losing a close decision to a future heavyweight contender. When World War II broke out, Palance's boxing career ended and he enlisted in the Army Air Forces, training as a B-24 Liberator bomber pilot. During a training flight, his aircraft went down and burned, leaving Palance with serious head injuries and burns that required extensive reconstructive surgery, an ordeal that permanently altered the gaunt, angular, unforgettable face that would later make him one of the screen's most convincing villains. For decades, that exact story, boxer turned bomber pilot turned burn survivor, was repeated as settled Hollywood fact in countless biographies and studio profiles. Here's where the story takes a genuinely fascinating turn. Later in his life, Palance himself pushed back hard against the legend, telling interviewers flatly that studio publicists had simply invented the dramatic version of events to explain his distinctive look, and that the reality of his wartime injury was considerably less cinematic than the story that had circulated for 50 years. Whatever the precise truth of that particular incident, the boxing record and his wartime Army Air Forces service are both a matter of public record. Before that late career triumph, Palance had already earned 2 earlier Academy Award nominations for Sudden Fear and Shane, cementing his reputation as one of the screen's most convincingly threatening presences for nearly 4 decades. Palance would go on to finally win the Academy Award decades later for City Slickers, memorably celebrating his win at 73 years old by dropping to the stage and performing one-armed push-ups in front of a stunned live audience, a moment that instantly became one of the most replayed in Oscar telecast history. Number 6. Lawrence Tierney. Very few actors in the history of Hollywood earned a reputation for genuine off-screen toughness the way Lawrence Tierney did, and almost none of it was manufactured for publicity. Tierney, who shot to fame playing the outlaw bank robber John Dillinger in 1945 and later starred in the film noir classic Born to Kill, spent much of his personal life caught in a cycle of heavy drinking and physical altercations that resulted in dozens of arrests over the course of his career, a well-documented pattern that ultimately made him difficult for studios to ensure or rely on for steady work throughout entire decades. Unlike many Hollywood tough guy personas built entirely through careful publicity management, Tierney's reputation for genuine unpredictability was something colleagues consistently described as completely real, and more than one actor who worked alongside him over the years said openly that he was someone you simply did not want to provoke. Decades later, when Tierney's career experienced an unlikely resurgence with memorable roles in Reservoir Dogs and recurring appearances on Seinfeld, directors and casting agents were reportedly drawn specifically to the fact that his intensity had never once required any acting technique to manufacture. He worked steadily, on and off for over 50 years. Quentin Tarantino himself later admitted that casting Tierney as the crime boss in Reservoir Dogs came with real personal risk, since Tierney's on-set behavior during filming became tense enough that several cast members reportedly kept their distance between takes. Tierney remained, right up until his death just shy of his 83rd birthday, one of the very few actors whose tough guy image was never seriously questioned by anyone who had actually spent time around him. Number 5. William Smith. William Smith may be the single most physically accomplished human being to ever regularly appear on American television, and yet outside of dedicated film fans and old bodybuilding magazine readers, almost nobody knows his name today. While serving in the United States Air Force, Smith won the service's light heavyweight boxing championship and its weightlifting championship in the same stretch of years, all while compiling an amateur boxing record of 31 wins against a single loss. He became a two-time world arm wrestling champion in the 200-pound weight class, held a black belt in Kenpo karate under legendary instructor Ed Parker after 8 years of training, and was, according to widely reported accounts from that era of bodybuilding magazines, a record holder for reverse curling a weight equal to his own body weight, though some later sources have suggested the verified figure was closer to 163 pounds rather than his full body weight. Even using the more conservative number, it remains a genuinely staggering feat of raw strength. On top of all of that, Smith held a master's degree in Russian language, which Hollywood eventually put to direct use by casting him as a menacing Soviet commander in Red Dawn. Despite nearly 8 decades in the industry and appearances in over 250 film and television productions, Smith spent almost his entire career playing henchmen, bikers, and intimidating supporting villains, a testament to just how effortlessly convincing his physical presence was on screen, built entirely on decades of real, verifiable athletic achievement rather than costume or camera trickery. Perhaps his most memorable big-screen moment came in 1980's Any Which Way You Can, where he played a bare-knuckle fighter who squares off against Clint Eastwood's character in a bar brawl before eventually becoming his ally. A fitting bit of casting given how much of Smith's own biography could have filled an entire film on its own. Number 4. James Garner. Before he became one of television's most beloved leading men, James Garner survived a childhood almost nobody would guess from watching his easygoing screen persona, fleeing an abusive home at just 14 years old and drifting across the American West doing manual labor, from installing telephone lines to working oil fields. In 1950, Garner became the first man drafted from the state of Oklahoma for the Korean War, serving as a rifleman with the 5th Regimental Combat Team. He was wounded twice during his 14 months in combat, first when shrapnel from an enemy mortar round struck his hand and face, and a second time months later when American fighter jets, unable to properly identify his own retreating unit, strafed his position by mistake, wounding Garner as he dove headfirst into a foxhole. He received the Purple Heart for the first wound immediately, but did not actually receive the medal for the second wound until 1983, a full 32 years later, after mentioning the incident during a television interview finally prompted the Army to correct the paperwork error. On the set of The Great Escape in 1963, Garner's real-life toughness surfaced in a very different way. During a private poker game at Garner's own house, Charles Bronson reportedly tried to renege on a bet he owed to a young extra working in Hollywood, and Garner, who wasn't even in that particular hand, stepped in and forced Bronson to pay up on principle. The confrontation grew heated enough that Bronson swore he would never work with Garner again, though the two never actually came to blows. It's a small story, but it says something larger about a man who spent his entire life refusing to look the other way, whether the stakes were $50 at a card table or his own life on a Korean hillside. Years later, on The Rockford Files, Garner insisted on performing many of his own driving stunts, including the show's signature J-turn reversal maneuver, and the physical toll of doing his own action work throughout that series eventually contributed to knee injuries that required multiple surgeries later in his life, a price he considered worth paying for authenticity. If you're finding these stories as fascinating as we did researching them, take a second to subscribe to the channel. We uncover stories just like this every single week. Number 3. Chuck Norris. Chuck Norris grew up in genuine poverty in Oklahoma and Kansas before enlisting in the United States Air Force at 18 years old, where he was stationed in South Korea as a member of the Air Police. It was there, largely out of boredom and a desire to protect himself, that Norris first began studying martial arts in earnest, training in Tang Soo Do, and eventually earning his black belt before returning to the United States. What followed was a genuinely dominant amateur competitive karate career throughout the 1960s. Norris went undefeated in professional middleweight karate competition for 6 consecutive years, a stretch of dominance that earned him recognition as one of the greatest competitive martial artists of his generation long before Hollywood ever noticed him. He eventually founded his own martial arts system, Chun-Kuk-Do, blending techniques from multiple disciplines he had studied and competed in over the years. His transition to film came largely through his friendship with Bruce Lee, who cast Norris as his antagonist in the unforgettable Roman Colosseum fight sequence in 1972's Way of the Dragon, a role that introduced Norris to international film audiences and set him on a path toward becoming one of action cinema's defining stars for the following 4 decades. Unlike many action stars whose fighting skills exist mostly through editing and stunt doubles, Norris's screen combat throughout his career was built almost entirely on techniques he had genuinely mastered and tested in real competition years before a single camera was rolling. He went on to headline the long-running television series Walker, Texas Ranger throughout the 1990s, and decades later became the subject of an entire internet phenomenon built around exaggerated tongue-in-cheek claims about his toughness. A joke Norris himself embraced with good humor, understanding that the exaggeration only worked because the underlying legend of his real fighting ability was genuine to begin with. Number 2. Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee's toughness was never a Hollywood invention, and in many ways it began long before he ever set foot on an American film set. Growing up in Hong Kong, Lee ran with local street gangs and became involved in enough real physical confrontations that his parents eventually sent him to the United States partly to steer him away from further trouble. Before any of that, he had trained for years in Wing Chun under the legendary instructor IP Man, developing the foundation for a fighting philosophy he would spend the rest of his life refining, testing, and ultimately transforming into his own system, Jeet Kune Do. Lee's physical capabilities became the stuff of genuine legend within the film industry itself, not just among audiences. He was famous for performing what became known as the one-inch punch, generating enough force to send a full-grown man flying backward off his feet from a strike that traveled barely an inch before making contact, a feat other martial artists studied for years trying to understand. During the filming of Enter the Dragon, Lee's fight choreography was so fast that camera operators reportedly had to slow their own footage down in post-production, worried that audiences simply wouldn't believe what they were watching was real if it played at its true, natural speed. Lee's training regimen was legendarily brutal, involving isometric exercises, extensive weighted training, and a level of physical conditioning that colleagues described as bordering on obsessive. He died suddenly in 1973 at only 32 years old, before Enter the Dragon was even released in the United States. But the influence of his genuine, hard-won physical mastery over martial arts cinema has never faded, and virtually every action star who followed him has had to measure themselves against a standard Bruce Lee set through years of real training rather than movie magic. Enter the Dragon went on to become one of the most profitable films ever made relative to its budget, launching martial arts cinema into the American mainstream almost single-handedly. And decades later, Lee was posthumously inducted into multiple halls of fame, recognizing not just his contribution to film, but his lasting influence on the actual practice and philosophy of martial arts worldwide. Number 1. Clint Eastwood. Long before Clint Eastwood became one of the most recognizable faces in the history of American cinema, he came astonishingly close to never getting the chance at all. Drafted into the United States Army during the Korean War in 1951, Eastwood was stationed at Fort Ord in California, where he worked as a swimming instructor and served as a bouncer at the NCO Club, quietly building friendships with several other young soldiers who would also go on to become working actors. Then, at 21 years old, after visiting his parents and girlfriend in Seattle, Eastwood boarded a Navy torpedo bomber as a passenger, headed back toward Sacramento. Somewhere over the Pacific near Point Reyes, everything went wrong at once. The radios failed, the oxygen ran out, and finally the aircraft simply ran out of fuel entirely and went down into the freezing waters of the Pacific Ocean. Eastwood and the pilot had no choice but to swim for the distant California coastline in the dark, in water so cold it could induce hypothermia within minutes. Decades later, Eastwood revealed something that made the entire story even more unsettling in hindsight. He learned years afterward that the exact stretch of water they crashed into and swam through that night was a known breeding ground for great white sharks, a detail he said he was deeply grateful not to have known while he was actually in the water. Eastwood made it to shore, completed his military service, and used the GI Bill to study drama once he returned to civilian life, a decision that eventually launched one of the longest and most influential careers in the history of American film and directing. Every gunfight, every stunt, every hardened character Eastwood would go on to play across 7 decades came from a man who had already, quite literally, survived being thrown into the ocean and swum back from it before anyone in Hollywood ever knew his name. Decades later, Eastwood would go on to direct Sully, a film built entirely around a pilot's emergency water landing, and he has said publicly that his own brush with disaster over the Pacific gave him a personal understanding of that kind of crisis that no amount of research alone could have provided. He went on to win multiple Academy Awards as both an actor and a director, remaining an active, physically demanding presence in front of and behind the camera well into his 90s, a level of career longevity almost unmatched anywhere else in the history of American film. 10 more names, 10 more stories the movie posters never told you. Some came from real combat, some came from real rings, real mats, and real gyms built through years of discipline that had absolutely nothing to do with a script. What connects every single one of them is simple. The toughness audiences saw on screen wasn't invented for the camera. It was already there long before the camera ever found them, forged in boxing rings, foxholes, cockpits, and city streets that had nothing to do with a studio lot. Now here's the question I want to leave you with. Between this list and our first one, which actor do you think would come out on top in a real no-rules contest of pure toughness? Let me know your pick in the comments. Subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one.